they create dedicated users. So not only do they let people do this, but they get people to do this over and over and over again. And they'll come back to doing it repeatedly. And they do this with fun. So they don't do this because they're compelled to. They do this because they want to, right? And I think that formula is what makes games interesting to people. It's the idea that I could take something that someone should not reasonably care at all about, and then I get them to behave in a completely different way than they ever would in any other context. And I get them to do it repeatedly, and they will choose to do it of their own volition for no other reason than just to do it. Right? That's the magic of what games do. And that systematic power, right? That systematic power we can create is this kind of fascinating thing to research, and that comes from certain features that games have. And all of these things can be leveraged effectively in gamification if you understand basically how they work. So I want to dive a little bit into how games do this by looking at some examples from games. And then at the end, we can talk about how that relates to gamification if you're interested. All right. So the first thing that games do that's really critical to think about from this context is that they create goals for people. Those goals are short-term and long-term goals. And the relationship between those two things is very important. So by goal, I mean literally what you're thinking of. And I like to think of, you should know that game designers think about games from every possible perspective. So sports are no different than Halo, is no different than Farmville. Like, they're all games, right? The goal is the objective. There's something that I'm trying to do. And in any game context, I need some kind of objective, even if it's light. If I'm not motivated to do something, then I'm not really playing a game. And I think this is especially critical when we think about the relationship between games and toys. Like, I can give you a playful object, right? I can give you a ball. And I can have you play around with the ball. But the ball will lose its value to you unless I give you a structure, or you give yourself a structure in which the ball has meaning. And that structure is a goal-oriented structure. It's basically, the ball becomes interesting when I have to get the ball in a hoop that's off the ground. Or the ball becomes interesting when I have to get it into a big net without using my hands. Then I create an activity that will be repeatable and repeatable and repeatable. That's what I'm trying to do, is create those kind of objectives. Now, this as a science was really pushed forward by a game designer named Sid Meier with a set of games called Civilization. And what Civilization taught us is the fact that a game doesn't necessarily have to have a single goal. In fact, a game could have multiple overlapping goals that each can be pursued individually in the same system. So what Civ was really famous for was this idea of micromanagement. So that what I'm looking at here is the view of a city in Civ. And you can see that there's like a bunch of resources on the field. Even if you're not familiar with Civ, you can just see the complexity of this thing by looking at it. There's a bunch of resources on the field. There's a sense of how many people are in the city, what all of them are producing. There's a sense of what's being built. There's a sense of like what kind of great people I'm valuing in the city. There's a sense of what I'm producing and how I can change that. And every one of those things is a goal I can push on. And this is just one city of what are probably at this point in the game, like, I don't know, 20, 25 cities, each with an interface exactly like this. And then a country which itself has stats like what they're developing in science and what kind of trade relationships they have, all of which can be pursued. And what that does, that overlapping goal structures, it means there's always something for me to do in Civ. Like, if I ever sit down in Civ, there's always something that I'm pursuing, and there's always something that's like 2 or 3 turns away from where I am. And so if you remember back when Civ was very popular around the times of Civ 2 and Civ 3, and you would hear these stories of people like losing whole days to Civ. Like, you know, like it would be some gamer in your office who started playing Civ at 8 p.m. and then you come in the next morning and they're in the same clothes and they clearly haven't showered, right? That's what does that, is the idea that like, oh, I'm just 4 turns away from getting that barracks. And then you get that barracks. And then you realize you're only 5 turns away from getting that railroad. So you might as well just play the next 5 turns. And then, oh wait, if I just wait 3 more turns, I'll get that army I need to make that attack. And then it's only really 4 turns before I beat that city. And then it's really only 5 turns before I beat that army. But oh wait, in 3 turns I'll get that airport. And when you do that, that becomes hours and hours and hours and hours. So what we really want to do is figure out how the service that you create, how the activity you're meaning to support, how the educational lesson you want to teach, or the propaganda you want to spread, like how those things can leverage these elements to be communicated, to be consumed, to modify behavior, to create dedicated users, and to make them enjoy it while they do it. That's how games work in the abstract half-an-hour sense.
Why are men more compelled to play games?
Well, they're not. Men are more compelled to play certain kinds of games. Men are more compelled to play competitive games. Men are more compelled to play difficult games. Men are more compelled to play complex games.
But whole genres of games that get consumed right now are consumed by other demographics, like social games, like the purchasing user of a social game tends not to be male, which is interesting. And I came out of casual games, which was really fascinating because we stumbled into casual games thinking that, like, especially PopCap, when PopCap started making casual games, they just assumed their audience was going to be 16 to 35-year-old males because that's who played games, and then it turned out to be 30 to 50-year-old women who were playing Bejeweled. And then a whole industry, a whole billion-dollar industry built up around making games for 30 to 50-year-old women that lasted basically until Facebook took that mantle away and then became a platform for a different demographic of women. And that, I think, was a sort of really interesting thing. Now, I think that why competitive games appeal more to men and why traditional games appeal more to men, I think it has something to do with some of the characteristics, the cultural characteristics of what men expect from leisure activities and how games leverage them. Because I think that is true. I think women are competitive in games, but they're not competitive the way men are competitive. Men play Street Fighter and they spiral kick someone in the head and then laugh in their face. Women tend not to do that. Right? But if you look at sites like Pogo.com, which was EA's really successful sort of casual game site, women would compete on Pogo.com all the time. There was like a subcategory of Pogo users who would compete all the time. They just wanted to do it in a different way. And I think that's it's a question of like how people are culturated and maybe what the biological intentions are. I don't know the psychology of it that well, but what I would say is ultimately like it gets to a really interesting question, like who's your audience, right? What I really want is to like come back every so often and do something. Like I check my email and I do my IM and I'm working on this document and I want to break. Oh, I'll pop over to Travian. Oh look, my people harvested. Great. Send them out to battle. Click, click, and then I go back to my email, right? Which is how people consume Facebook games. Unless they're super addicted whales, right? In which case you can get money from them to keep going, so you basically charge them to keep going. Right? Like sure, if you want to spend an hour on Farmville, great. Give me $10. And you can spend as many hours as you want. But like I know that the average user doesn't want to do that, so I push the average user out of the system so they don't get bored with it and they come back. Because that's the flip side. How deep is Farmville? Well, it can't be that deep for its audience. It's got to stay kind of simple. But if it stays that simple and everybody grinds on it for 40 hours at a time, they're going to figure out how simple it is and they're not going to want to play it anymore. So let's just get them out the door. And when they naturally come back, we'll show them more. So I think that, so to answer your question in a broad way, I think the reason why MMOs have trouble in other spaces is because they're not designed for other spaces. An MMO is designed like a hardcore game that I'm going to sit with and play for 7 hours at a time. If it wants to work on a mobile space, it has to figure out how you can create an MMO activity that fits in the bucket of 5 minutes of me standing in the supermarket to make this work. And when they figure, the game that figures that out will be the MMO that's successful on mobile, but it won't look like an MMO on a computer.